Islamophobia today. I mean, you can't really talk about Islamophobia today without looking back over the last few decades. In particular, after the 9/11 attacks, when Muslims faced a huge amount of vilification. Stories of potential bomb attacks were used to justify police raids, and even actually shooting. So everyone knows that the Dementis case, but actually he wasn't the only individual shot, in his case fatally, but actually two other brothers, their homes were raided, and one of the brothers was shot when the home was raided. So that's another example of what was going on around the fear against Muslims. And what you saw was a real sense of a real increase in abuse and attacks in the streets. But that kind of fear didn't just go away after 9/11. What you've seen is a continuous growth of that fear and attacks against the Muslim community. So what we saw was a huge amount of racial backlash after the murder of Ree Ligby. It was on a much greater scale than what we saw after the 7/7 bombings. Now, interestingly enough, even when the 7/7 bombings took place, 50 people died and over 700 were injured. There was only a sporadic attack against Muslims and their properties. But you compare that to what happened after Woolwich, and you see a massive increase. So compare this to the figures from Faith Matters, which is a think tank that logged 193 anti-Muslim hate incidents in the first 6 days following Lee Rigby's murder. That's 193 incidents, and this included 10 attacks on mosques, one in particular that was burnt down, that we all know about. And this figure is 15 times higher than the average rate the year before, where we had 12 anti-Muslim hate crimes a week. So it's quite shocking, the increase of attacks against the Muslim community. We also have an organisation called Tell Mum. I don't know whether you know it, but it's an organisation that collects data around anti-Muslim hate. And they recorded 221 Islamophobic incidents in the week after the killings. 221. And you compare that with what we had the year before, which saw 532 attacks throughout the whole year. So compare that to just a week after the incident. It's pretty horrific. And at the time that even the Metropolitan Police Commander came out and said that we're seeing attacks increase by 8-fold against Muslims. So it's pretty horrific. Teesside University, I don't know if people know or have seen the study, just produced a study that shows that racially motivated attacks in Greater Manchester have shot up by 40%. And in particular, race crimes have gone up to 51% from May 2003 to February 2014. Again, pretty big figures. And I think it's really important to put it into context. Why are things so different between the 7/7 attacks and what we saw after Woolwich? And I think one of the key things is a wider Islamophobic narrative that has been played out and set by politicians and commentators. They set the agenda in a sense. And what you saw at the time was, I don't know whether people saw the first coverage in the press, but the BBC led on the story by saying the attackers look Muslim. But I don't know what Muslim looks like. I mean, yes, it was a woman, yes, maybe it was a hijab. But if you're a Muslim man, what does that mean? Do they mean the colour of your skin or what? It was quite interesting. But actually, the press really did go all out on this, and the label they gave was Islamic fanatics wielding meat cleavers. And what we saw also was that politicians of all parties coming out, condemning it and asking all good Muslims to come and denounce what happened. And then it's not surprising on the back of that at the time, a YouGov poll showed that 1 in 3 people thought Muslims were a threat to democracy. I mean, 1 in 3 people in Britain thought that Muslims were a threat to British democracy. Pretty horrendous figures. And really what we've seen in the decade following 9/11 is the connection between Muslims and terrorism, fanaticism and intolerance. I mean, it's become everyday language. And what's really happened is a normalisation of Islamophobia within British society, I think. And it's become acceptable. I would say very much that in contemporary Britain today, racism towards Muslims is acceptable. And it's probably the only form of racism that is pretty acceptable in our society today. But who can remember that actually it was Jack Straw, the then MP for Blackburn, who actually started off the discussion in 2006 around Muslim women and their dress. For people that probably, some of the younger may not know this, but actually Jack Straw came out in 2006 and explained that when Muslim women that wore the veil came to his surgery, he started by asking them to remove the veil. Now let's think about this. He's a man in power, and women that are vulnerable come to him for help. And the starting line from him is, we would like to remove, and I would like you to remove an item of clothing. That's pretty damning for anybody. But actually, rather than focus on that issue, the press and everyone else, the commentators, other politicians, actually didn't talk about that. What they talked about was oh well, you know what, he's got a point. You know, these women that wear the veil, what they're doing is they segregate themselves. They don't want to be part of the wider society. It's not good for community cohesion. They went as far as to say that actually some people that saw these women in the street felt scared. Some people who went further and said, actually, we need to speak about this issue because these women that wear the veil are oppressed, and actually we need to speak up for them. So it became very much a narrative between, actually these women are really scary and dangerous and damning to the British, social cohesion, to being oppressed. So it's one or the other. It was quite interesting, and actually, when people talk about women being oppressed that wear the veil, it's not just right-wing commentators. Some of the left join that. I mean, I remember at the time, there was a full-page article in The Guardian, and it had a picture of two Muslim women pushing prams, and they were wearing the veil. And the headline from a female commentator was, "The most offensive thing in British society today." I mean, think about it. There's lots of things to be offended about. The Nazis, the racism, unemployment, maybe the Tories, but no. For this Guardian writer, the most offensive thing was women wearing the veil. I mean, really think about it. And at the time, we had Tony Blair, who was the then Prime Minister, come out and talk about how, it's true, these women that wear the veil were distancing themselves from society, and it wasn't good. Gordon Brown actually went further and said that he agreed with Jack's rules and comments, and actually it would be good for Britain if Muslim women removed the veil. Really think about it. There's a couple of hundred women in this country that wear the veil, and it was better for British society if those women chose to show their faces. Makes you wonder what our government at the time were doing. Maybe explains what crap government they were, if that's the way they do politics. And really the debate around the veil is one of the earliest and most simple examples of how Muslim women have come to represent both the threat, as I said, and at the same time the oppressed, depending on which part of this argument you want to pick up. And it goes a long way maybe to explaining why actually one of the biggest crimes, increase in crimes, is actually attacks on Muslim women. It's one of the biggest growth of crimes in this country. The stats around attacks on women, Muslim women in particular, the way the veil have massively increased over the last few years. So, jumping on. But actually it wasn't just a veil, we didn't just stop there. The then Home Secretary, John Reid, went into East London, a very working class, poor area, lots of Muslims living there, and he went into East London and decided to lecture Muslim parents. So what he said was, fanatics are looking to groom and brainwash your children for suicide bombings. And he also went on to tell them, look for the telltale signs, or your kids are going to be at risk of being lost forever. And basically what he went on to say was that actually Muslim parents should know what their teenage children are doing and thinking at all times in case they're on the route to becoming extremists. Now really, let's think about it. For teenagers in this room, how many of you want your parents to know exactly what you're up to and what you're doing and what you're thinking? It's just, same with parents, how many of you knew what your teenage kids were up to? It's not acceptable unless, of course, you're a Muslim parent, in which case the way we judge you are on different lines than what we judge the rest of the population on. And then the Home Secretary chose to describe the 9/11 attacks in the US, the 7/7 attacks in London, and the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan as a battle between modern and fanatical values in Islam. And basically what he was doing at the time, I would say, is fueling this idea that this war was against, not just a war on terror, but against Muslims, and actually against Islam, and that Muslims are the threat. That's really the implications of what he said at the time. And then you fast forward a few years and you have David Cameron, the now Prime Minister, in 2011 come out and use Muslims to argue that multiculturalism has failed. So he goes to Munich, sits there in front of all these European leaders, and he argues that actually multiculturalism has failed, and we can show that by demonstrating the problems within the Muslim community in Britain. Let's just go a step further. For people that don't know, he chose to make that speech on the day that the EDL were marching in Luton. And he couldn't have picked a worse moment to attack Muslims on an international platform. He also went on to blame Muslim groups, and it's important to say this, he wasn't blaming terrorist groups, he blamed Muslim groups, your standard Muslim group, for festering Islamic extremism. That's really what he said in that speech as well. Regards to the fact that at the time, tens of thousands of campaigners of all backgrounds, of all religions, regularly turned out to defend Muslim communities under attack. Mainstream commentators claim that Muslims have made themselves targets by apparently refusing to integrate, their children don't speak English, and they live in segregated communities that follow a faith and a way of life that is hostile to Britain, Europe and Western values. These ideas clearly, what they did actually at the time was to place the onus on the victims of racism rather than the society which propagated these ideas and these racist ideas. At the same time, we see the Tories produce a review of the PREVENT programme. So I don't know how many people know about the PREVENT programme, but actually it was a programme that was initiated by the Labour Party after the 7/7 bombings. And it basically what it does is it provides funding for local communities, community groups, local councils, youth groups, and other organisations in the name of combating terrorism. But actually what it really does, just to explain this, it's to combat terrorism, and part of the thinking behind it is that these groups will be able to identify potential extremists. That's really what it was about. We're going to give you money to run community groups and all sorts of initiatives, and in return you're going to identify potential future terrorists. But in essence what it did was create a climate of suspicion against all Muslims. And so you have this programme that the Labour Party set up. The Tories then review that programme, and what they do is actually come out and decide that they're not going to focus just on violent extremism, but they're going to focus on all extremists. That was the Tories' rewrite of that agenda. And basically what it does is basically say that actually all Muslims are under suspicion, all Muslims are a threat of extremism. And actually only a few weeks ago there was a training session for PREVENT in the City of London, and one of the things that they said is that colleagues on this training course should look for telltale signs of extremism within their colleagues. And can you imagine what those telltale signs were? Any ideas? Well, let me explain to you. What was, shockingly, that they started, what was it? Let me get this right, because I don't want to get this wrong because this is really important. What was growing a beard? So if you start growing a beard, you're on, you could be a potential extremist. Exactly, Doug, I'd be worried. But don't worry, you're not a Muslim, so your beard's fine, you're safe. I know. And the other one was Islamic clothing. So if you start wearing Islamic clothing, I'm not sure what that is and how they define it and how they describe it, but apparently these are telltale signs of extremist behaviour under the PREVENT agenda. Seriously worrying, this agenda, isn't it? And so basically what it does is that any form of radicalisation is seen as a threat. So basically what they're saying is Muslims that propose to have alternative narratives or political analysis of the causes of violence in the Muslim countries in the Middle East are potential extremist radicalisers on the path to violence. So basically, if you have an alternative, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Afghanistan, if you start as a Muslim talking about the fact that you think the wars in Iraq were illegal, it makes you an extremist or a potential extremist. Can you imagine what we're saying to most of us today about Palestine? But let's not forget, most people in this room, I think, would have a different analysis of what the government think of as to what's happening in the Middle East. And that would be acceptable. You are allowed to have your opinion, unless you're a Muslim. Because if you're a Muslim, under the PREVENT agenda, you're on the road to becoming an extremist and therefore a threat to British society. And you could potentially go and blow something up. Which is absolutely crazy when you think about it. And actually, to go even further, reports have shown that within the PREVENT agenda, it's actually young people that have been targeted the most. They're the people that are most a threat. So youth workers and schools collaborate with the police to identify individuals who they think are en route to being extremists, and they face radicalising interventions. Now, I haven't actually been able to identify what that is, but apparently that's what it is. And I have no idea how they do this, how they identify this. But let me give you an example. We've had people pulled out of school for talking about what happened, what was on the news the night before. We have had people pulled out of school under PREVENT for Googling the word Bin Laden. These are things that potentially make you a potential extremist in the future. This is what they're saying. Now, the Channel programme, which is a particular section within PREVENT that targets young people, have seen a rising number of young Muslims referred to as being at risk of extremism or violence. Now, between 2006 and 2007, 8 young people were targeted under this PREVENT agenda. That's 8 people between 2006 and 2007. But actually, between 2012 and 2013, can you imagine where that number jumped to? It jumped to 748. 748 people were held under the PREVENT programme for being potential terrorists. Not being terrorists or extremists, but potential. So they're being identified as being future potential extremists. And it's really important to say that 35% of those people, 35% of the 748 people were below the age of 18 years old. That's quite a scary figure. So you've got things like people Googling, people talk about what happened on the news. The youngest person who's been referred under the Prevent agenda that I know of yet is a 9-year-old boy in East London. That's pretty scary. That you decide that a 9-year-old is already on the route to become an extremist. And also, for people that don't know, every NHS employee has been given training to spot potential extremists, as the government sees Muslims who seek medical care, including for mental health, problems as potential targets. Anyone who is a Muslim who goes to the NHS for treatment could be a potential target under the Prevent agenda. Muslims have been approached to spy on others when signing on for benefits. One man was asked to spy on other Muslims when he went to report a burglary to the local police. I mean, this is what's happening under the Prevent. And only a few weeks ago in Manchester, for people that don't know, in Manchester there was a national conference, a housing conference for housing associations. And I just happened to be looking at the agenda, and one of the sessions on that conference was keeping our community safe. I wasn't really sure what that meant. Maybe it was some kind of health and safety issue around social housing. Actually, when I looked at the speaker list, the key speaker, and I have to make sure I get this right, the key speaker was a North West Prevent officer. It's a housing association conference, and the key speaker is a North West Prevent housing officer. So now, basically, what the authorities are saying is, if you're in social housing, not only are you a scrounger, but you're also a potential terrorist. That's what you've been there for this. And in all of this rhetoric around extremism, the experience of seeing Britain and the West wage imperialist wars in the Middle East over more than 10 years is never taken into account. It's never acknowledged as a potential reason for radicalisation. In fact, Prevent uses grievances and comments made about injustice, oppression and foreign policy as evidence of tendency for future violence. So as a Muslim, basically what they're saying is, if you make a comment about foreign policy, you could be a future potential extremist and be involved in some kind of terrorist violent act. We've seen a number of arrests and guilty verdicts under the counter-terrorism laws over the last few years, ranging from a bookshop owner who was arrested for having a book in his bookshop, this is a public bookshop, anyone going, on the shelves of his bookshop, he was arrested because they said that the book that was in his bookshop, that title was found in the homes of terrorists. They also said, literally, that this is what happened. He had a book that was not on a banned list, that was available freely on the internet or on Amazon or wherever else. He was given 4 years in prison for having that book. Really damning statistic. And actually, I've lost count of the other numerous arrests, but one in particular in Manchester, obviously that's where I'm from, so I know this case very well. We had a situation in Manchester where Munir Faruqi, who is now serving 4 life sentences on the grounds of preparing people for terrorist acts. Now this is a man who would run what they call a dawah stall, so he would set up a stall, very much like the SWP does on a Saturday when we're selling our papers. He set up a stall and he was giving away free literature about his religion. He had a permit to do this, but actually they said that stall was being used to recruit young people that could then be asked and trained into going into extremist and violent acts abroad. And let me explain the evidence, because this is very important. There is no physical plot at all that this man was involved in. But he's been given 4 life sentences. He's now actually carrying out this 4 life sentences. He's just lost an appeal. The only evidence they had against Munir Faruqi is that 2 undercover police officers that gave evidence at his trial. It turned out that these 2 undercover police officers, very well known to the community, not because we like police officers by the way, but because actually they had become Muslim, apparently, and had befriended Munir Faruqi and wanted support because they were new Muslims. And he had had them in his home, he had taken them to local mosques, and it was only during the trial that we then discovered that these guys have spent the last 9 months investigating 10 mosques within Manchester, in South Manchester, and they have hours and hours of recorded conversations between different people in the community. And it was just their evidence that these 2 guys, undercover police officers that met Munir Faruqi, is now serving 4 life sentences. And then the authorities wonder why we find it so difficult for Muslims to trust and be more open in our mosques. If we're not having to worry about undercover cops or Britain First, we're having to worry about people spying on our community. I mean, it's a pretty uncomfortable situation to think you're under. And also, I've lost count on the number of people that have actually been stopped and searched, have been held for days, and then released without trial, without charge, without trial, without a single apology or anything. And this happens quite often. It's quite shocking. I know actually only was it last year, the year before, we had the complete social moral panic around the 9 Asian men from Rochester who were found guilty of sexually exploiting young women. Now there's a huge outcry about this. You would think that this had never happened before. And actually what happened is the Children's Minister, Tim Lofton, was asked about the Rochester abuse case, and this is what he said. I might explain some way towards why there was such a huge outcry and moral panic. Political correctness and racial sensitivities have in the past been an issue. Lofton added that the authorities still have to be aware of certain characteristics of various ethnic communities. This is what he said as the minister. What exactly does he mean by these comments? Is there really any evidence that political correctness and racial sensitivity stop the police investigating certain cases because they involve Pakistani men? I mean, really, when have we ever accused the police of political correctness and sensitivity? Really, it makes you think that this man lives on a parallel universe because he doesn't seem to know the police I know. Also, what does he mean by 30 characteristics of various ethnic minorities? Is he really saying that Pakistani men and by extension Muslim men have a cultural fondness for child abuse? Because let's look at the figures, there's nothing supporting this. 95% of those in the Greater Manchester sex offenders register are white. West Yorkshire police figures show that out of 53 arrests for grooming offences in the 3 years prior to this case, 47 of those arrested were white. They're quite clear figures to me, but actually when the press and the media, when the political commentators talk about grooming, they only talk about it in relation to Asian men and Muslim men. We never hear about it when they talk about white cases or white cases. It's something really that, in the British societies, I think grooming has become associated with Muslims or with Asian men. Even now, there's nothing. There's no figures that support that. There's absolutely no evidence for what Lofton's comments were. But actually what you see is the media coverage completely tried to cement a link between Pakistani men and child abuse. And all sorts of theories came out and were put forward to justify this, including the religion of the men, their culture, and their supposed view of white women. Even though none of the figures backed any of this up. Now look at all the celebrities of a certain age being charged with sex offences right now. We haven't picked apart BBC culture or the celebrity culture to explain their crimes, and we most definitely haven't accused all white men of a certain age of having a fondness for children. Yet you see what happened when it comes to Muslim men or the young Asian men. And that's not the only case where you see extreme reporting or moral panic about what Asian men are doing. Last June, 6 Asian men were sentenced to 18 years in prison. I wasn't aware of this figure. 6 men were sentenced to 18 years in prison for planning an attack on an EDL march. I mean, that's pretty horrific, especially when you compare it to the kid-gut approach that the police and the state have towards EDL and BNP demonstrators, despite their violence, their racism, and the calls for anti-Muslim pogroms. These young men, and I'm not saying what they did was right, but 6 men get 18 years in prison for planning an attack on an EDL demonstration. And last July, we had the Daily Mail, the bastion of don't need to say that. The bastion, we had Daily Mail, who newspaper decided to attack Channel 4 News because Channel 4 decided to broadcast the call to prayers. Now let's just explain this. The call to prayers lasted a couple of minutes. They did it during Ramadan, which was 1 month out of the 12 that we have, and it was broadcasted before dawn. So most people missed it, including Muslims. But the Daily Mail decided to attack the Channel 4 coverage of this. And basically what they said was, their reason for attacking Channel 4 was that Channel 4's actions were apparently divisive, in bad taste, and part of the anti-Christian bias of the intellectual establishment. This is what they said. This comes from the Daily Mail, who supported German Nazis. Let's not forget this. This is the Daily Mail that we're talking about, the bastions of the establishment here. And now what are we seeing? One of the latest things we're seeing is the whole threat apparently that we've got with young Muslim men apparently going over to Syria to fight against Assad. We're being told how terrible this is, that they're extremists, they're over there fighting, and actually we're being told that they're going to come back here and they're going to be a threat to British society. Let's not forget, Cameron tried to win a vote to go to war against Assad in support of the very people that these young men are supposedly going over there and fighting for. Let's not forget that. This is, the hypocrisy of this is unbelievable. And then we're being told that there's thousands of them. I'm not seeing any of the figures, but apparently there's thousands. I've seen no facts and figures, but it doesn't stop the media from making these claims, or the politicians. And we're also told that actually they're going to be a threat to British society when they come back. Now why? There's no evidence whatsoever that these young men have an issue with what's happening in Britain, or have actually come back and carried out any crimes. In fact, from what I can tell, when they have come back, they've surrendered to the authorities, been arrested and put into prison. They haven't gone into hiding, they haven't sneaked into the country with a load of weapons and blowers or anything like that. What? Okay. And apparently the government put out an appeal, apparently to Syrian mothers, to asking them, or Muslim mothers should I say, asking Muslim mothers not to allow their sons, or to stop their sons from going out and fighting there in Syria. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it? Because I can remember not so long ago, as Chair Stop the War, campaigning with another mother, Sue Glenton, who was campaigning to stop her son from being sent to an illegal war in Iraq. Here is this one mother who's being persecuted for not forcing her kid to go to war, and then they're telling Muslim parents not to go, to stop their kids from going and fighting with revolutionaries in Syria. And actually, the latest attack, just quickly, is a Trojan horse. What we're seeing in Birmingham is basically what's happened is there's a dossier, an anonymous dossier. It's funny how it's always anonymous, isn't it? An anonymous dossier that Gove took so seriously that he decided to investigate these schools. But he decided to investigate not by having a head teacher go or anything. He asked a top counter-terrorism police officer to investigate schools in Birmingham. That's what he decided to do, because obviously these schools were such a threat. And basically, just to explain, when the BBC decided to report on this story, they chose to illustrate this story with pictures of number 30 bus destroyed in the 7/7 attack, and a picture of Lee Rigby. Basically what they're saying is they're making a connection between the situation in Birmingham schools and how somehow this is going to directly be related to the loss of Birmingham lives. That's what they said. They ran the story and they showed a picture of Lee Rigby and a blown up bus after 7/7, and they're talking about local schools in Birmingham. Now, some of you may not know this, but Gove actually wrote a book, and it just happens to be a coincidence that a chapter of this book, the book is called Cells of 7/7, if any of you have had the misfortune reading it. But so he published a book after the 7/7 attacks, and a chapter in that is called The Trojan Horse. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but it does make you wonder, doesn't it? And in that book he wrote, it is reassuring to imagine that the problem we face in this is restricted to a very small group of individuals. However, then he goes on to explain to us all. Extremism is in fact prevalent in the Muslim communities in Europe and UK. So basically what he's saying is the Trojan horse is not just extremists, it's all Muslims in society, and we're all a potential threat to British society. And it's really important to say that this rise in Islamophobia isn't just confined to Britain. We've got the ban on building mosques, we've got the ban on veils, we've got the ban on minarets going across Europe. And basically what this does is create an atmosphere across Europe of we should all be scared of Muslims, they're the enemy within. Somehow that Muslims are trying to, Europe is becoming Islamified and we need to put a stop to it. This is really the narrative of what's happening. And you see this narrative being played out in the most vicious way when Breivik actually murdered 77 people in Norway. That's really what that narrative and that sense of hatred towards Muslims actually goes to. And over the decades, over the last decade in particular, we've seen commentators and politicians insist that actually Islamic values are somehow incompatible with Western societies, and somehow Western societies grant democracy, we're all into women's rights and gay liberation. But actually, before we allow the ruling class to rewrite history, let's not forget all those things that they talk about, the battle of Western society, are things that the working class people in Britain fought for, and we're still fighting for. It wasn't given to us by the ruling class in Britain. It's not a part of Western democracy for gay liberation or women's rights. We're still fighting for those issues in this country. And these commentators go on further to say that the problem with Muslim societies is that because they're so much devoted to religious scriptures, they're impossible to have any real cultural science come out of these communities. That's really what they're saying. And basically what they're trying to do is try to characterise all Muslim societies as somehow being backward because of their faith. But actually, this phenomenon may be quite new when they talk about Muslims. So it's not really new when it comes to Asian people. We've heard this very often in the past as well. I'm going to jump to it because I know I'm running out of time. Let's not forget, I want to just go for a bit of history because we get told that actually there is no cultural science coming out of Muslim nations. But actually, it was Islamic scholars who translated and preserved the philosophy and science of the ancient Greeks and Persians. And they then taught it to the equivalents in Spain and Sicily. And it was also easily proved that early Islamic societies of Persia, North Africa, and India in the early middle parts of the last millennium were far superior and freer than those of Europe at the time. For example, in the 13th century, there was a Syrian scholar and physician, and he basically came up with the discovery that the pulmonary circulation of blood, he came up with this discovery, and he had a nice distinguished career, and then he died peacefully in his bed. Fast forward 200 years later, and we have another person who tries to come up with the same theory. This was a Spaniard who in 1553 came up with the idea that, came up with the same idea basically. And what happened to him? He would burn at the stake. Apparently he was burned at the stake because he was coming up with the notion of heresy against God. This was 200 years later after the Syrian came out with the same theory. So this idea somehow that actually Muslim societies are backward does make you wonder. And actually, you can look at more recent history. So the demand for migrant labour to help rebuild Europe in the wake of the Second World War saw millions of Muslims come over to Europe to help build Europe. And look what happened in Germany. If it wasn't for the Turkish workers coming over to rebuild the cities after the war, Germany wouldn't be the nation that it is today. And also look at Britain. Look at the NHS. Where would the NHS be if Muslims from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India hadn't decided to come over to this country? And it's really important to say one thing. The person living and working in Europe, Muslims have become an integral part of the working class. And you saw that. I mean, Muslim people or Asian people are just as, if not more likely to be members of the trade union movement. So you see on the demonstration on Thursday where it's a mixed community. It was a multicultural workers out striking together. But the problem is, you see, that a lot of Muslims seem to feel that somehow Islamophobia is quite new, that actually that they're on their own, that they're under attack. But it's really important to say that actually Islamophobia couldn't exist if we didn't have early forms of racism. We've always had racism in society, in a capitalist society anyway. It's always existed, but it's just been a different target. Today's Muslims, prior to that it was Asians. Prior to that, not so long ago, it's black people. We hear so often that they're feckless, they're work shy, all that kind of stuff. The stuff that we're seeing now with Islamophobia wouldn't have existed without these early forms of racism. And I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to jump quite a lot. But it's true that British Muslims now find themselves specifically targeted, not just because of the colour of their skin, but apparently some kind of values and beliefs that we supposedly hold. But as socialists, it's really important to understand why people can look towards religion either as a form of faith or as a political ideology in the face of oppression. As such, we never equate Islamists with fanaticism. It's really important to say fascism is something completely different. Fascism is a movement of the petty bourgeoisie, which ultimately presents itself as a tool for the ruling class that tries to break any kind of working class organisation, trade union organisation. Islamist activists are different. However much whatever their weakness of their political ideology, they pose a challenge to the system, albeit in a distorted and inconsistent manner. But unfortunately, there are people, even in the left, that actually do equate Islamists with fascism. In fact, some will go on and make it even shocking. So we had actually not so long ago, especially around the first Gulf War, and even around the Iranian Revolution, people that would fight against racism, coming out and supporting the imperialist leaders, coming out and supporting the ruling class by saying, I would rather support imperialists over Islamic fascism. That's what they said around the time of the Iranian Revolution. We also have people that were traditionally anti-racist coming out and supporting the Gulf War because somehow, Muslims are fascist, it was the same thing. But it can never be the same thing. It's really important for us to say that. And I think it's really important to say that at a time when we have austerity, at a time when we have people fighting back, the tools that the government uses, the tools that the ruling class use to weaken the working class is racism. It's a tool to smash the class, to divide us. Actually, if we allow that to happen, we would not have the great demonstrations that we had on Thursday. Because if you buy into the idea of what the ruling class is saying, they're actually there to blame. What would you do? Would you have your demonstration here or your picket line here and the Muslims or the black or Asian people stand over there? This is not, we can't allow the government to divide us. We have to stand united. We have to understand that Islamophobia might be something new. The idea of racism is all part of the same thing. This is nothing new. Islamophobia is just another form of racism that is allowed to divide the working class. And we can't do that. We have to stand together and recognise that, yes, there are times when we have our differences, but actually when it comes together, we are part of the working class. Muslims, Asians, non-Muslims, we're all part of the working class. We have to stand together.
Well, as Nahella's argued, prevent is one of the main ways in which Islamophobia is legitimised. I think we have to be quite clear about one thing that it actually represents, and also the fact that a number of people, I feel like sometimes Muslims as well, are actually engaged with prevent, and we need to be able to have sometimes a nuanced argument about that. In my college, we recently had a training session for some members of staff, organised by Prevent, which is a Home Office initiative, talking about the danger, the risk of some Islamic students' mind, being radicalised. Now, up to 2 years ago, I remember this was initially tried in higher education. I think in higher education, largely through the University College Union and people organising in that, it was actually knocked back. For the time being, we're quite weak in my college, but it's something we're going to have to engage with. But when I initially had some discussions with some other people helping to build the union, some of them were sympathetic to the initiative, and therefore we have to have, I think, a nuanced argument in some cases about it. The starting point is to remember the people who are telling us about Prevent, and also the people who actually set it up and actually set it up in the first place. And one of them, obviously, was the Labour government with Tony Blair, who was trying to make a comeback from his status as a war criminal. And I think there are two things we have to remember about that. The first is Baroness Manning Buller, who was ex-head of MI5, who very clearly identifies the invasion of Iraq as being something that actually has created a greater risk of terrorism in this country. We don't necessarily have to agree with her, but that's the first thing to stick Tony Blair with. And the second thing is that this whole issue of Syria, the idea that there's large numbers of people that are likely to come back from this country, which again Nahella's dealt with, but Sir Richard Dearlove, who is an ex-head of MI6, so we've got MI5 and MI6 on this, saying, no, it's all about sectarian conflict between Shias and Sunnis, and there's no real danger. No, we don't take any joy in that at all. On the contrary, in fact, we take, as a country, responsibility for the invasion of Iraq that's created the situation in the first place. I think that's one of the arguments you have to have with people. But the other issue about Prevent is this. Some years ago, a Pakistani man went from London to, I think, Afghanistan, did actually join the Taliban, changed his mind, came back, and with his brother set up a youth club in East London to actually try to de-radicalise youth who were going through the same experiences that he went through. And he described them as extremists, and I pointed out to him that I, and probably most of the people in this room, would be regarded by the Metropolitan Police as extremists, and therefore it's an argument we had to have in a nuanced way. But he did this before Prevent was set up. Not only was he trying to do that, he also organised a fantastic meeting with Marzin Beg, who came back from Guantanamo Bay, and put a very nuanced position as well, arguing about, wanting to fight against these things, but at the same time, not necessarily actually arguing quite strongly against some of the political Islamists. That's an argument which Islamists have to have. We can, if invited, play a role in that, but it's an argument that people have to have reasonably against the attacks on Islam that is going on throughout the world. And it's quite reasonable in those circumstances people are radicalised. We have to be able to deal with that.
During our spring in Ireland, I'm from Ireland, SWP member, and I was an election candidate for People Before Profit. Lost at around 2.9% of the votes, but I have a different story to tell about that just in a minute. During the Arab Revolution, one of the Irish newspapers had a big headline: 10,000 Islamists marched. No, there were 10,000 school teachers. Right? In a country like Egypt, obviously the majority of them would be Muslims, but it was the title, 10,000 Islamists march. You can imagine why they would do that, right? Imagine a situation, imagine a report, right, that says in Jordan, 52% of women after the age of 15 experience sexual or physical violence. In Bahrain, that's 45%. And let's say in Yemen, that's actually 44%. And the average of sexual, physical, economic violence against women in Middle East, predominantly Muslim part of the world, is actually 33%. What will the European media say? It will drill into Islamic culture, lifestyle, and everything else, right? It was actually a European Union report, the biggest of its kind, done with 42,000 women interviewed over 28 countries, and it's actually Denmark 52%, Holland 45%, and France 44%. That is the percentage of women who said they were exposed to sexual, physical, and all sorts of violence after the age of 50, and European average was 33%. What happened in this report? That was done over 2 years of extensive research, put on a shelf to just collect dust, basically. And we ignored that, but if it was a Middle Eastern report, we would have drilled into those things, right? This is the sort of hypocrisy we see from our rulers around here, in this part of the world, while they're cutting all social services that actually looks after the well-being of women, single mothers, working class women, and all sorts of things. And on the other hand, is extremely worried that France will be Islamicized by 3 in 100,000 women in France, that's 0.0029%, are wearing the burqa, and therefore we should engage the whole state machine to prepare a report for 9 months and engage the European Court of Human Rights to endorse this ban and let other European countries follow suit. In Denmark, the whole Copenhagen University department spent 6 months preparing a 169-page of report. Islamic dress code and public service. One of the examples they gave was, would actually be okay for a woman wearing the veil driving a public bus? It turns out, of the 300, 400 women wearing the burqa, more than half of them were actually born-bred Danish. Was their decision, their choice, right? Okay. It turned out none of them wanted to drive the bloody public bus. So, but 6 months, the whole establishment engaged with all of these things. Can I tell my story very briefly about it?
Very quickly.
30 seconds. I was a candidate, and first of this kind of an attack happened to my election campaign, what you know here in Britain and in France as a bacon attack. My election posters were sellotape plastered with bacon. All my election posters. Of the 200 posters we put up, 70 of them were destroyed, and there were bacon pieces left around my house. In Ireland, we never thought these things will happen. We never thought this sort of racism will come to Ireland because there's no organized racist fascist organizations. But obviously they are learning. They're learning from their organizations around Europe. Now, one thing that made us very clear in terms of this specific incident that happened to my election campaign was the necessity and the need for a united front to fight racism at every level. And the necessity and the need to explain the fact that Islamophobia is the in-racism of the day, and the necessity that unless we fight Islamophobia, we cannot have a stand against imperialism and against this rotten system that actually divides people, divides workers, let 9,000 women in Ireland lose their homes with their children sleeping in their cars, and that tells us that 49,000 Muslims in Ireland, which is 1% of the society, is flooding the Irish landscape. And they present documentaries up to an hour on public national TV to tell us how much of a danger Europe is actually at. Europe is running the danger of being fascized, not Islamicized. And our job as European socialists is to defend the rights of Muslims and show the European working class the risk is UKIP, EDL, or Le Pen of this world, not Muslim women with their veils.
Hi, I'm Bridget Parsons from Birmingham. I'd just like to say a few things about what's been going on in Birmingham this year. We've said quite a lot at Marxism about we're here educating ourselves, but we're doing that so that we can go and intervene in the real world. And I think SWP has intervened in Birmingham quite well because of that. And the first case I'd like to look at is the attempt by one of our colleges to ban women in the niqab. So in September, some women that I taught last year wanted to move up to FE college and carry on with their education, and suddenly, they weren't allowed in the college if they were wearing a niqab. Some people on the left find that quite difficult defending the niqab, but what in fact happened was straight away we had a protest. Students from the college, teachers, SWP members and others, really vibrant protests out there, and within a few days the college had backed down when we were allowed to wear the niqab, and actually the principal resigned. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the tsunami that's kind of descended on Birmingham with this so-called Trojan hoax or horse effect. You've said a little bit about it, and this is just something that some people, we straight away in the SWP got out a petition saying that, stop the racism, stop the Islamophobia, there is no Muslim plot. And, we put that online and there were thousands of people signed it within days. Whereas some people on the left, and unfortunately at the NUG conference, were sort of arguing that, well, we don't know, maybe there is a plot. We have to wait and see what the inspectors say, which was a terrible position to take, I think. I think that Gove, in attacking these, he thought he was going to be able to split the communities, because with sort of, homophobia in some of these schools, or Christmas trees being banned, or terrible things like that, mention of segregated classes, these kind of drip things, I think he thought would divide us. But actually what's happened in Birmingham is there's been a fantastic campaign. We've had 2 brilliant meetings, one of over 100 and then one of 500 to 800 people, mixed Muslim, non-Muslim, absolutely brilliant, really the community coming together and saying, hands off our schools, stop these racist attacks, stop the Islamophobia. And I think that's actually taken over a bit by surprise. The level of support, and like last Thursday it was great to see there were parents from the Hands Off Our Schools campaign marching side by side with teachers from some of the schools and governors with placards and protests and chanting together, and that really showed our strength. So the campaign's still going on, but we have a really good basis, I think, to fight it. Just some of the things, because we're not, but just briefly, it just is not the case that these schools are being attacked for certain things, but actually things that happen in all our schools. So that's why we're saying, it is not the case that in all schools around the country, for instance, sex education or is well dealt with, or that there's no homophobia. That is not the case. The issues that are in some of these schools are actually issues in all our schools, and that's why we're saying, this is an Islamophobic attack, and issues that there may be in individual schools, they should be dealt with separately, but not part of something that labels all these schools as somehow being part of a Muslim club.
Hiya. I just wanted to talk about, I've experienced my own special brand of racism, being, I'm not on camera, being, as most people would see as Chinese, though I'm actually mixed race. You get people asking, well, aren't all Chinese people this colour? Aren't all Chinese people that colour? Why aren't you submissive? Oh my God, you're speaking out. Oh my God, you laugh, you have a sense of humour. All these sorts of perspectives come out. And I also happen to live with a Syrian couple, and they're Muslims, and they fled the war in Syria, and they came to Britain. And even I speak to my liberal friends, and I get questions like, does he make her stay indoors? Does he make her wear the veil? She doesn't actually wear the veil. Has she had to fight him against his horrible sexist beliefs because he's Muslim? Do they let you eat what you want, or do they make you eat, only have Muslim foods in your fridge? And all that kind of stuff. And you combine that kind of, I guess they call them microaggressions, or these beliefs, in this very limited way that I've experienced. And you kind of think, well, if people are being radicalised, well, why do you think that is? Do you think that's to do with culture, or do you think that's the constant Islamophobic attack they're being put under? And also, we can say that because of this attack, what has happened is that their eyes have been opened to the viciousness of this state and this system that we live under. And what we can show is solidarity, and hopefully they can join us in a fight to make a better society.
Helge from Norway. Yes, the worst thing about Islamophobia is, of course, the oppression of the individual in itself. That's a starting point. The second, of course, again, is that it's splitting the class, splitting the struggle. But a third element, in fact, is that it's also an attack on democracy. And when we heard the term radicalization, which have been used more and more, that's a really symbol of that. And we as left-wingers, we should know that, because the history is long and we know who is the next target. And I'll tell you a story about that, because I think you find it very unbelievable. But I am a member of the IS tendency in Norway, and 2 years ago I was contacted by the main broadcasting company in Norway. They wanted to have a so-called interview with me. And I didn't know what they wanted to talk about. But then they suddenly gave a picture of a guy who actually had been a spy in our organization for the Norwegian secret police. And he had been following me to Marxism being at this kind of meetings, pretending that I was going to have a secret meeting with the FARC in Colombia, etc., etc. The real issue behind this, of course, was that our organization at the time was very, very strong in the peace mobilization, etc. But intrinsically, the Norwegian Broadcasting Company, they gave him a secret microphone, and he went to talk to his officers in the secret police. From that, the discussion came out. And what the officer was interested in was that IS role as a radicalizing force. That was the discussion was all about. And he commented on that it was very interesting whether or not we will split with a more soft left-wing group or we will be independent, because if we were independent we will again radicalize the movement. And what does that mean in a sense? That means that we will organize demonstrations. And we take a demonstration one step forward. That's what they think about radicalization. And that's why we have had exactly the same discussion about, as you know, about people going to Syria, which were youth being at school with my children, grown up in Norway, and of course they went to Syria because they started from being very inspired by the Arabian revolt, and that's of course fine as part of taking part of democracy. Of course there can be problems related to that, but I must end up saying, you mentioned Breivik, and actually I was talking at Utøya one day before the attack, and knowing that I myself at the time was survived, I had secret spies on me going there as a socialist, while Breivik was going there without any notice at all. For me it's kind of, you understand what kind of feeling that gives to me. But as you see, there is a real connection here. Okay.
Yeah, I've read the book. This is book which isn't available for bookmarks, but I'm sure if you want, they can probably get it for you a bit of profit for bookmarks on it. But this is Michael Gove's call to arms, really, against Muslims, and it's he doesn't write it as saying all Muslims all the time, couches it in the words of Islamism and stuff like that. But really, when you read through the book, it's quite clear that he's saying there's a spectre haunting Europe, and that is Muslims. And so, and where he really starts from in the book is talking about the liberal metal not being good enough. We should really have the wars that we fought. We should have fought them to the end to get rid of these people and that people. The description around why a lot of Muslims don't like Israel isn't because of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. It's because Israel stands as this bastion of democracy in this huge totalitarian swathe that is the Islamic world, and that's where he's coming from. And so when we think about what's happening around extremism in our schools, this is his point of departure, if you like, for when he's looking at it. And one of our schools in Birmingham, I'm a teacher in Birmingham and help run the NUT there. One of the schools that failed was a nursery school, and the nursery school failed for not implementing the Prevent programme and rooting out extremism in a nursery. Now, quite what extremism in a nursery would look like, I've got no idea. I was trying to sit little Abdul down as a 3-year-old and say, now, you're not going to join Al-Qaeda, are you? This is a bonkers scenario. And part of what they were talking about really is they wanted to set the school up for spying on parents. That's what part of it was. So if the kids don't turn up for a week, maybe it's because dad's gone to fight in Syria and stuff like this. And the schools that have failed around countering extremism, from the nurseries to the secondary schools, it isn't because they have found examples of extremism in the schools, because Ofsted went in and couldn't find the extremism in the schools. So the schools have been failed because they haven't challenged the extremism that Ofsted themselves couldn't find in the schools, which is a bonkers scenario, and one actually that could be a danger to any school, because Ofsted can come and say, well, this could happen, but we haven't found it, and therefore you failed. And so this is about trying to police a much wider community, as well as establishing a racist agenda with this.
Okay, just quickly, I do want to make a point of saying that what's happening, in the Birmingham schools is not just in Birmingham. So, for instance, I just found out today that a school in Bradford has had the same inspections along the same lines as what's happened in Birmingham. I'm aware of 3 schools in Bolton but are going through the same thing. Now, having spoken to various people involved in these schools, they're saying to me, well, we're keeping quiet because we don't want our kids to go through the trauma that the kids in Birmingham go through, and quite rightly. But actually, there's another reason they're keeping quiet. They're keeping quiet because they're scared. Because they don't know how much support they've got that they can look towards, whether it's the left or other people in society. They're scared, and I was also told last week that there are 75 Muslim charities that are now under investigation. 75 Muslim charities. I mean, that's a shocking number. I mean, I remember when they tried to investigate Interpol, I think there were 3 investigations. Never found any connections with Palestinian terrorists or groups or whatever, but it didn't stop them from hounding those charities, and now they've got 75 charities. And I said to one individual, I said, well, do you not think we should get the 75 charities in the room and do something? And his response to me is, we're all looking to Birmingham. We're looking to see what happens to that campaign. So we have a responsibility, as socialists in this room, we have a massive responsibility about what we do around this issue. We talk about, having a united working class. This is the one thing that is not going to unite us. That fear that's in the Muslim community that makes people keep their head down is what's going to stop us from uniting and building a mass movement, a mass working class movement. And I also want to say that what they start with in the Muslim community doesn't stay in the Muslim community. So, for instance, the schools, yes, they investigated a number of schools in Birmingham, but I have no doubt there are going to be a number of other schools that they're going to investigate. And there's talks now of taking the schools in Birmingham out of the local authority control. This is, it's a ploy, isn't it? It's an easy target, and Muslims are an easy target. I remember when there was this uproar around students being kettled on demonstrations. Actually, I wasn't that surprised because I've seen police do that. But actually, police don't. I've been on various UAF demonstrations, and I've seen police kettle demonstrators. But actually, when they kettle the Muslim community, they didn't kettle the Muslim community on a demonstration. They kettled them in their streets. I went to a demonstration in Bolton, and there were young Asian lads at the age of 13, 14, 15 who were kettled on the end of their street for hours. It's really important to say this, that they start with the Muslim community because that's an easy target. Because of Islamophobia, they've been able to build Muslims are an easy target, but it doesn't stay there. They started with Muslims, and they started with a massive sentencing around the Gaza demonstrators, over 100 demonstrators that were arrested. Let me just explain, by the way, people probably don't know this. They were arrested and they had quite a severe sentencing. But actually, they were arrested, not on the demonstration, but using counter-terrorism laws, where their homes were raided at 4 o'clock in the morning, completely geared up. That's how these young kids were arrested. And then you see those arrests, and then you see what the police did on student demonstrations, where there are hundreds of arrests. I mean, the biggest arrest role in student demonstrations is to follow what they got away with around the Gaza demonstrators. It's really important for the working class and for socialists to understand that. We also have the counter-terrorism laws. You think that's confined, in most cases, to Muslims, but actually, let me explain this to you. When we had a UAF demonstration in Bolton, to the lead organisers, both from Greater Manchester and the national leader in UAF, they were both arrested on that demonstration. Their homes were raided on the back of that arrest. Their homes were raided using the counter-terrorism laws. So they had this law for terrorists, supposedly Muslim terrorists, that then used against activists. But this is really important to understand. They go for the weakest link, and what they can get away with, they go further. I don't know whether people were here on the opening rally when Manji, young asylum seeker from Afghanistan, who's actually from Manchester, who spoke about dispersal orders and what she went through with housing when they tried to move her. What they went through with her, with the way they treat immigrants in this country, asylum seekers, where they give you cards rather than money and all that kind of thing. They're now trying that on the working class. The bedroom tax, what is that if it's not dispersal of the working class? We have to understand this. They start with the weakest, whether it's asylum seekers, whether it's Muslims, and they go across to all of us. And basically what they want to do is, they want to smash the working class, they want to keep us down. And I want to just quickly finish on this. The Islamophobia in Britain is not as bad as across Europe. Let's be very clear about this. But this is not because British people are nice, or because we drink hot tea, or because we play cricket. Let's be quite honest. It's because there are united fronts built in this country that were very principled. When UAF was set up, it was very principled. It worked with Muslims. It worked with everybody. And he said, we have our differences, but we know who the enemy is. Now, unfortunately, the left across Europe didn't have the same position. It didn't. Look at France. They did not confront the National Front. They did not. They had their demonstrations over there. They allowed Le Pen to mobilise over there. I'm really proud to say that actually in Britain we fought back the EDL. And I'm from Manchester, I take great pleasure in saying that we beat Nick Griffith. It was the most fantastic night, absolutely fantastic night. You know, on the election night, when he crawled against the wall of the town hall to get away from the anti-fascist campaigners, I've never seen him look so coward, but it was fantastic. Not that I ever wanted to come that close to Nazi, but actually it was a great, I'm not going to forget that look, it's not a massive achievement. But it wasn't independent of it. It wasn't just it didn't just happen. It happened because we're organised. It happened because we have a revolutionary party, the SWP, that has certain principles, theory and practice that go together. And we proved that. We proved it by the fact that we beat the EDL, we confronted them on the streets, we beat the Nazis in the ballot box. And we have to keep building it. This isn't going to go away. We can't just get complacent. We have Britain first now. And we know we've got the elections coming up next year. With a fight back against austerity, the government and the ruling class are going to come for us. And they're going to be vicious. You see what's happened around UKIP with immigrants. We know the Tory party are going to use racism, and we have to beat them. But the only way we're going to beat them is not by, yes, racism is important. We have to fight racism in any form, Islamophobia, whatever else it is. But actually, we have to beat austerity. We have to beat austerity. We have to have a working class movement against austerity. But more than anything, we need a socialist society. And one of the ways of getting that is to become organised. Get organised, get active, join the party. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for coming, and hope you enjoy the rest of Marxism. If you want to find out more, just speak to people outside the red form. Thanks very much.